So this version of the story in Samuel seems pretty straightforward. The prophet Samuel's been sent by God to choose the next king of Israel.
Yep. But there's a plot complication. There's already a king. The first one that Samuel anointed, King Saul.
And it's worth noting here, we didn't include that part in the reading, it would have been even longer. Samuel never really thought that Israel should have a king in the first place, right? Israel was a confederation of tribes. They were sort of loosely organized. And Samuel made the point that God was their king, and that if they had a human king, that king would take their crops for his table and would take their sons for his war and their daughters for his harem. But the people,
like kings do.
Yeah, like kings do. But the people clamored, and frankly, they kind of whined.
Everybody else has a king. How come we don't get a king? Is that fair?
Yeah, actually, I think that's very fair. At which point Samuel said, and if everyone else jumped off a cliff? No. And so finally God said, fine, we'll send them a king. And through Samuel, God chose Saul. But Saul did not work out very well. Saul was not a very good king. He wasn't a very godly king. He made mistakes. I mean, everyone makes mistakes. But Saul had a tendency to use God as a good luck charm. When something needed to be accomplished, Saul would call on God. Or when Saul wanted military status or a victory, would call on God. Maybe it was his ego, maybe it was his insecurity, maybe it was mental illness, but God is ready for someone else, someone who's more headed in a God direction. And so sends Samuel to visit Jesse and his sons, even though Saul is still king.
Now, when we read this story 3,000 years later, we think, well, of course David is going to be chosen king, because we hear David and we think king. David was the greatest king of Israel, but it was not obvious at the time. In the normal patriarchal order of things in the ancient Near East at the time, the eldest son would be the one who was favored. Maybe the second son in a pinch, but certainly not the youngest, the kid who's out watching the sheep on the hillsides. Why would God choose young David to be the next king?
And so we get a hint a couple chapters earlier where God is speaking to Samuel and says that God is looking for a leader after God's own heart. And that gives us a clue. God is looking for someone whose life purpose is to be, as best they can, God's person in the world. God's looking for someone who is so awestruck, so grateful for God's love and grace that fuels all that they do, and that's what God and Samuel saw in David. And so they anoint him.
It's worth saying that that's not only what God is looking for in a king.
Yeah.
It's what God is looking for in all of us. Complete love and passion for God.
And David lived that passion out through his whole life. We saw it earlier in his battle with Goliath.
Foreshadowing, we will read this next week.
And we witness it in David's complete confidence that God will be with him. We see it again and again in his leadership in the people of Israel. Whatever's facing David, he is God's guy. Whatever else you might say about David, he was a man of great passion.
Now, it is really worth noting that while David's passion endeared him to God and made him king, it also got him into trouble. Most notably in the case of a particular beautiful woman named Bathsheba, who happened to be married to one of David's generals.
And we'll talk about that in a few weeks.
But if you don't know the story, suffice it to say that David's passions got him into a lot of trouble.
Right.
David was flawed, as we all are, and he experienced a lot of trouble in his life and a lot of tragedy in his life and a lot of sorrow when he misdirected that passion. But through it all, David always loved God. He was a human, flawed human, after God's own heart.
And really, you can read the whole Bible as the story of God in a love affair with humankind. God as the steady lover, and humankind as fairly unsteady. But we see it in God seeking Adam and Eve out in the garden, heartbroken that they've turned away. We see it when God sends Moses to rescue the enslaved Hebrews and says, "All I want is for you to come and be with me on Mount Sinai." Whenever the nation of Israel got lost in politics or in infighting or power grabs, God sends prophets to them to tell them what they're really supposed to be about is loving God. And that was Jesus' message as well. Love God, love yourselves, love each other. That is what it's all about. And tragically, we've missed the boat as individuals, sometimes as the institution of the church, in countless times over the years. And through it all, God continues to long for our love. And at our best, we love God back with endless passion. And sometimes that love comes so easy, the way the beauty of the world can just spring gratitude out of us. Or the way awe at someone else's generosity or heroism or kindness opens our own hearts to our possibilities to be God's people in the world.
But sometimes that love comes hard because life is hard. And God's will and way is sometimes inscrutable. One of our favorite quotes is from the 16th century Spanish mystic named Saint Teresa of Avila, who wrote once in a very honest moment of prayer, "Oh God, I don't love you. I don't even want to love you, but I want to love you."
I don't know about you, but that's where I am some days, right? That wanting to want to love God is pretty much the best I can do. And it's good to know that I at least have St. Teresa for company.
About, good grief, it's going to be almost 20 years soon. Almost 20 years ago, when I was pastor at Trinity United Methodist Church in Montpelier, Vermont, we held a community-wide worship service called Eucharist, which was just starting to catch on. It was where it was a worship service, including a communion, that was wrapped around the songs of the band U2. Those of you who are younger, it was a band back in the 90s and early aughts. We chose U2 as the theme because so many of U2's songs have those same strong biblical themes of love and justice and redemption. And so for this Eucharist, and it bragging rights, the first in northern New England, we got a band made up of local musicians in Montpelier, one of whom was Aeneas Mitchell, the singer-songwriter who went on to create the Broadway musical Hadestown. And their little band was called Sputnik. It was an 80s band. And the band was great. And the worship service was fantastic. The church's huge sanctuary was packed with young people, and we had taken out several of the front pews without telling the trustees to make room for people to dance. And there was so much good energy and singing and dancing and celebration. It was awesome.
And when it came time for the communion, I was in charge of doing the welcome for that part of the service, and I looked out over the congregation, and I knew that there were many people there who had been to church but had turned away from it, as well as many people that had never been to church, certainly had never been baptized, probably had never come to communion. And
you must have had like a Missouri Synod Lutheran voice in you.
half of my family is Missouri Synod Lutheran, and they were saying in the back of my head, if they're not baptized and approved by the pastor, they can't have communion. And I was saying back to that Missouri Synod Lutheran voice in my head, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, believed that communion could be a means to grace and that anyone could come and have communion. And so in that spirit, I faced this crowd of people and I said, you don't have to be baptized to come to this table. This is an open table. You don't have to go to church to come to this table. You just have to love God. Actually, you just have to want to love God. In fact, if you just want to love God, you are welcome at this table. Jesus is here and ready to feed you. And then we went on and we blessed and broke the bread, and we blessed and lifted the cup and began to serve. And not everyone came forward, but most people did. And Aeneas Mitchell came to have communion and said to me afterwards, that's the first time I've ever done communion. Thank you so much for making it so meaningful for me.
After the service, I had a woman come up to me who said, I grew up in the church, but I'm a Wiccan now. And this is the first time in years that I have felt safe enough to try to connect to Jesus again.
Right.
The folks who came forward for communion that night were not church people.
Well, some of them were.
A couple of them were. But they were people, some of whom loved God, but hadn't felt allowed in church. Or they wanted to love God, but didn't know how. Or they wanted to love God and weren't sure that was enough. But as Jesus assures us in his wonderfully earthy parable this morning, that wanting to love God is enough. A tiny mustard seed of passion, of desire, of longing to love the divine and be loved back. That's all God needs to work with. That's all God is looking for. For God will grow that tiny seed in ways we neither recognize or understand. It's not up to us to do the growing. In Jesus' parable, it is just up to us to be open to what God will make of us. All the ways God will love us and invite us to love God back in the way we love one another and love this fragile creation. It's just up to us to be willing to grow beyond our own understanding and planning. Growing to yield the fruit of hospitality and welcome where, parabolically speaking, even birds, others who aren't sure they are enough for God's love, can nest in the branches that God grows in our lives.
And for you, for us, where is your passion? What is the longing that God has placed in your heart? And what is your unique way of loving God, or wanting to love God, or even just wanting to want to love God? Because however small it is, hear this lesson from today's readings. God can work with your heart, with your love, with your longing. Whenever you open yourself up to the working of the Spirit, God can do amazing things in you. Whatever you have is enough to start. And God will grow you in ways you can't even imagine, even to the healing of this world. Amen.